Hi folks, with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you're driving along in your truck or your car or on public transport. In this essay, I'd like to talk about inflation, or price inflation in particular, but we'll look at inflation as in a wider context, but price inflation in particular, and why do Western governments lie to us so much about price inflation? Why, when rents and mortgages or rents are like doubling every few years, why does the government say, "Wow, inflation's only 2% or 3% or something"? Now, just on rent alone, and given the proportion of the average wage that's consumed by rent, just on that alone, the inflation rate would be well over 10%. But somehow they never seem to calculate it that way. They've got a strange way of calculating things. Unlike, say, 25 plus years ago, where the inflation rate was the inflation rate. But today it's a concoction of ideological politicization. But let's have a look now. If you go on to if you go online and get into your national, and I'm talking Western countries here, your National Bureau of Statistics or Office of Statistics or whatever it's called, and you look at what's the rate of inflation, price inflation we're talking here, between 1970 and today. And so what's $100 in 1970 with price inflation, what would it be worth today? So I did that, and it came sort of anywhere, depending on whether you went with a private research firm or not, but anywhere between, say, 8 to 10 times. So $100 in 1970 today on price inflation is going to be worth somewhere between, say, $810 and $950, somewhere in that range, depending on whose numbers you rely on. So I'll take the government numbers here and say it's $810. So that's their claim. So just to repeat, on price inflation alone, $100 in 1970 is worth, according to the government, is worth $810 today. All right then. Well, let's just do some examination on that. Let's check these numbers. Now, let's look at, say, a house that was purchased in 1970. So 1970, $100 in price inflation, $100 is $800. Look at $810 according to the government. So let's now look at the real on the street, on the ground, real life type inflation, and see if it matches up to the 8.1 times that the government claims. Okay, so a house purchased in 1970 for $24,900, or say $25K, just round it off, is today, or as in 6 months ago, sold for $3.39 million, so $3.4 million. So $25,000, this is in real estate terms, $25,000 in 1970 is valued at $3.4 million today. Now that's 140 times, not 8.1 times as the government says, but just on real estate alone, 140 times inflation over that same period. So can that be right? I mean, that seems like an awful lot. So that's definitely the prices. So that's absolute fact there. But the inflation rate is 140 times. Now, if you look at the amount, the cost of servicing a mortgage and the proportion of the average wage that it would take to do that, then this 140 times inflation already changes the inflation number just on the real estate alone. That's before you put food on the table. Just on real estate alone, that means that the rate of inflation is 30, 35, 36 times. So instead of again, this is just price inflation on real estate. So instead of $100 being $810, we're talking $100 would be $3,600. So a very different picture when it comes to inflation. And I'm being generous and going to the lower end of the scale here. Now, if we look at other things in, like, say, that means the real estate inflation, or the cost of living, and thus the price inflation, is 17 times higher than the government says it is. So why is there such a disparity between reality and what the government says? But I'll come back. Let's go further on here. Now we look at, say, the price of energy, and I've done a basket here of electricity and oil or petroleum. So now that's increased or inflated by 22 times. So $100 in 1970 is $2,200 today. But the government again says that's eight times in a basket of averages. So that can't be right. Steak, and now just on the price of oil and electricity, there's the Green New Deal, which is pushing up the price of electricity through the roof, and also a lot of government taxes are now on oil that weren't on oil in 1970. So that creates, so tax also plays a role in this. Now we look at something that isn't taxed, food. So we look at fresh food like steak and, say, eggs, milk, and we can throw bread into this. That's, again, many times more expensive in inflation terms from 1970 prices than it is today. So how do they arrive at the 8.1 inflation, when inflation is clearly, manifestly, far and away greater than 8.1? Now, other than purposeful duplicity and misinformation, which is clearly a case of it here, other than that, though, we need to look at how, if you read through some of the documents that the government puts out, they jump around from price inflation to core inflation, as they call it, and also variable inflation. And I've mentioned this before with inflation. So that if the price of say, I don't know, beef goes up this month, then the government will argue that this calculation process will argue that, well, people will just go and buy chicken or pork or something like that, or they'll go and buy lamb chops, whatever. They won't buy beef. So the inflationary effect of the price going up of beef is zero. So they can just arbitrarily determine that. Now, if the price of, say, lamb chops goes up the following month, then they can say that, well, people aren't buying lamb chops because the price went up. They're all going to buy beef. Well, beef went up the previous month. But we're not measuring it this month. So we can say that people just change their spending habits, and thus there's no inflationary effect because they just go and buy something else. Now, I do see the point behind that, but what it means is that the price of chicken go up the next month and pork the following month, that they've all gone up by double. But because they went up at different times, and the government argues that spending patterns would change, they can say, well, there was zero inflation, when in fact all the cuts of meat have gone up by double. But because of this a double dealing and marking cards and so on, they can claim that there was no inflation when in fact there was a great deal of it. Now they can do the same thing with say if rents go up, they can just argue, well, people will just go and rent cheaper premises. So really there's no price inflation on rents or mortgages, property generally. There's no price inflation because people just would rent a cheaper place, or they would live more communally and therefore shared accommodation. Therefore there is, so they can just invoke those things to say, well, there was no inflation. If the price of petroleum goes up, well, people will just drive less. They won't go for a weekend drive. So therefore, there is no inflationary effect because they just consume less fuel, or they use less electricity. Therefore, there is no inflationary effect because they're just using less electricity to offset the price increase. Now, all these things are technically, at least, in an abstract sense, they're valid, but the reality is that people still have to use the electricity. Maybe they use a bit less, but the point is they're still paying the higher price, and there is still inflation. If you want to use electricity, you must pay that price. There's not an option. So these things were all inflationary. If you look at the price of bread now. There's something called the bread index, actually, which goes back hundreds of years, which was interesting. But the price of bread compared to what it was. Now, the argument is there are cheaper loaves of bread that have, less wheat in them, and they've got more, shit in them or something like that. And they're smaller loaves, they're smaller slices and smaller, fewer slices in the loaf, it's less weight and that sort of thing. So the argument is, well, those cheap loaves are available. We'll just compare the much bigger loaf of bread from 1970 to this smaller loaf today, and hey, we can say there's no price inflation. So they're using all sorts of various devices and deceptions and tricks and conjuring acts, if you like, to declare that inflation. But the reality is that if you look at price inflation, particularly the essentials of life, accommodation being one of them. And if you just take an average, then the price of rent and real estate, even if you're generous and look at the lower end, outer suburbs, smaller compact apartments and these sorts of things. Even then, you're looking at the price of rents and real estate being well over double the increase in wages. So if you look at inflation over the time, then the government declared number of 8.1 times is way below what the actual rate of inflation is. So and again, just looking at real estate alone, just that, then you'd still be looking at an inflation rate of compounding of 6 or 7% a year. This to me illustrates the extent to which we get lied to and deceived, but it also conceals, or goes to some way to concealing the reduced standard of living we have, the reduced purchasing power. And just to bring that home, this is average wage, a 2-income family has less purchasing today, has less purchasing power than a single income family did in 1970. I mean, that clearly illustrates where we're at. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.